They believed that the state could intervene in the market in order to make more equal opportunity for everybody, so that everybody had the chance to develop their God-given potential.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Politician, journalist and spiritual thinker, Alfred Deakin was one of Australia's founding fathers and 3 times Prime Minister of Australia. He was a complex and compelling figure. A truly deep thinker, he was at the intellectual heart of Australia's early democracy and, of course, its liberalism. But despite his profound influence on the nation's development, his legacy around the shaping of the Australian settlement and white Australia remains a subject of debate even today. Joining me to discuss Alfred Deakin is political historian and a biographer of Alfred Deakin, Professor Judith Brett. Welcome to Afternoon Light.
Thank you.
Great to have you here in Melbourne, in the Old Quad. This topic, this person has been quite a passion of your intellectual academic life. You obviously have written significant works on Robert Menzies and Australian liberalism, but what drew you to Alfred Deakin initially?
I think initially it was that I actually just thought that we needed a new biography. I was teaching and I had postgraduate students and things, and there was the Linneau's biography that was published in the 1960s, which, you know, is a very thorough and impressive piece of scholarship, but it's really more a history of the policy of the Commonwealth in the first 10 years than it is a biography of Deakin. Deakin the man, you don't really get a sense of it. And it's also long. It's rather turgid. And I thought we need a readable book on Deakin now. Somebody should do this. So I suggested it to John Rickards. He didn't want to do it. I suggested it to David Marr. He didn't want to do it. And in the end, I thought, well, I'll do it myself.
Fair enough.
And, so I became more interested in him as I went on. You know,
And this was through your work on Robert Menzies and Australian liberalism?
Yes. I mean, I'd written a book called Australian Liberals and the Moral Middle Class. I mean, the first book I wrote on Australian liberalism was on Robert Menzies, called Robert Menzies Forgotten People. And, I mean, that starts with Menzies. But I was interested then in going back before Menzies to where Menzies' ideas had come from. And so then I wrote a book called Australian Liberals and the Moral Middle Class, from Alfred Deakin to John Howard. So Alfred Deakin, he's the beginning of 20th century liberalism and the first Liberal Party that is formed in 1909. So I already had an interest, you know, knew a bit about Deakin. So I guess then I just went back the next generation to see where Deakin had come from.
Yeah, and what had influenced him.
Yes.
You wrote this book, before we get on to Deakin per se, you wrote this book at his house, didn't you?
I wrote some of it, yes,
Yeah.
or I did a lot of reading there. Deakin was a great writer. I mean, he wrote reams and reams and reams of stuff. He kept a prayer diary. He kept other diaries. He kept journals. He sort of seemed to write at night. He was a bit of an insomniac. And one of his daughters, after he died, typed quite a lot of this up. So I'd bought copies of this from the National Library, where Deakin's papers are. And I took those down there, and particularly around when the new Liberal Party lost the 1910 election to Labor, when Labor became the first majority government, Deakin was very shaken and puzzled by that, and he wrote a lot about that. And he wrote that at Ballara, sitting on the, you know, so I sat on the veranda in a nice cane chair reading this and trying to get a feel for him, I guess.
Yeah, and this is the house, of course, in Point Lonsdale on the Bellarine Peninsula in Victoria. Tell me about Deakin's early life then, Judy.
Okay, so Deakin is born in 1856 in Collingwood. It's now, the street I think is now Fitzroy, but, you know, anyway. His father and mother had emigrated shortly after they married in 1849. They'd gone first to Adelaide and then they'd come to Melbourne. And his father was running a coaching business. I think with his brother-in-law, they were driving coaches between Melbourne and the Goldfields. And so Deakin is born. His mother, I think, was quite depressed. There's only 2 children. There's a daughter who's born very soon after they arrive in Australia. And then there's a big gap. And I think there's probably miscarriages and things in between, because I actually think that the fact that Deakin is one of only 2 children is really significant in understanding his life, because at that time, these early colonial families were having masses of children.
Yeah,
7,
it would have been
8,
quite
9
unusual,
children,
wouldn't it? Yeah.
And his father is not rich. He's a small businessman effectively. And it meant he had enough money to pay for Deakin's education. So to begin with, at 4, Deakin is sent to boarding school in Kyneton, probably partly for his health, because there was very high infant mortality in Melbourne. There was no sewerage system. Infants were dying of gastric upsets, basically. And Deakin's father was at the death of one of his nephews. And so I think that was partly to get him out into fresh country air. His sister was already at this boarding school in Kyneton.
And so this is at the age of 4?
At the age of 4, And I think that also feeds my idea that probably his mother wasn't managing very well. Then when Deakin's about 7, they move from Collingwood across the river to South Yarra, and they build a house in Adam Street, which is very near where the synagogue now is. And Deakin goes to the New Melbourne Grammar as a day boy. And so he gets, for his class, he gets a really good education. He actually finishes school. Whereas when you look at somebody like Henry Bourne Higgins, who is of the same generation and also becomes a really important Liberal in Australia's sort of early formation, he's having to work from when he's about 14, working as a I think he works as a pupil teacher because he's one of 7 or 8 children. Yeah. So Deakin, can stay at school and matriculate.
Yeah. And then he goes on to university?
Yes,
which also would have been unusual, I guess, for someone of his class.
Well, at that point, his father must say, now you've got to start earning some money. So he starts working as a pupil teacher and as a tutor. I think he teaches for a while at Christchurch, South Yarra, and he goes to Melbourne University. You could do law part-time at night and enroll. I think it was for a sort of a slightly lesser degree because you couldn't do arts because the arts lectures were on during the day, but you could study to do law, and that's what he does.
Yeah, yeah. And did you get a sense then of his interests, what sort of things he was drawn to and how that might have been, I guess, pushing him in a certain direction?
Well, he was drawn to the theatre.
Oh, right.
He thought he could become a great actor, and he was writing.
Well, Menzies and Harold Holt both have similar aspirations in a way, don't they?
He wrote some fairly bad verse plays and hawked them around the various theatrical agents and didn't get anywhere with them. Thought he could be a poet. So he had literary aspirations, but they were all aspirations to do with words and drama. And at this stage, in his late teens, he starts to get involved with spiritualism.
Yeah, this is a really interesting influence we don't talk about spiritualism much these days.
No, well, it's not that fashionable.
No, it's terribly unfashionable.
But it was quite fashionable then.
Yeah.
And he and his sister form their own little seance circles. Now, middle-class people were doing this all across the English-speaking world at this stage. We're talking about the late 1870s. And
so it was sort of a fashionable thing to do.
Yeah. It was sort of in the air, but, like in broader historical terms, it's part of the sort of crisis of faith in the middle of the 19th century after Darwin publishes The Origins of Species, and there's real debate about science versus the Bible. And Deakin's, the headmaster at Melbourne Grammar, was very much interested in science and in a more modern curriculum where they taught modern languages rather than Greek and Latin. So spiritualism is a way where people, I've thought quite a lot about this with Deakin. He didn't really believe the sort of orthodox Christian religion. He wasn't that interested in Jesus or Virgin Mary or any of, or miracles. But he did want to believe in a divine universe.
Yeah.
And he wanted to believe in eternal life.
Was spiritualism compatible with Christianity? Could you be both? Could you be?
Well, you could. It was theistic. It had a single God. You probably, at that stage, Deakin's not that interested in the sort of drama of the crucifixion and the resurrection. In fact, that never really seems to capture his imagination. But anyway, he and his sister form this spiritualist circle, and I think they invite a well-known medium over to sort of give them a hand. And it turns out anyway, Deakin is an extremely good medium, and his hand starts flying across the paper, and he gets invited to join the most prestigious seance circle in Melbourne, which has middle-aged men like the government astronomer and leading Collins Street surgeons and things. And again, his hand starts flying across, and lo and behold, John Bunyan starts sending him messages. So he writes, under the influence of John Bunyan, he writes this book called The New Pilgrim's Progress. And so I think spiritualism is important to him in a couple of ways. One, it gives him a whole lot of drama in his life, which he likes, but it introduces him to some of the sort of intellectual elite of Melbourne.
Yeah. That was his sort of entree card to this group.
Yes.
That he otherwise wouldn't have met, given his class and social status.
Yes. Yeah. And they all think he's terrific.
Yeah.
He's very handsome. He's charming.
And he's still a teenager at
Yeah,
this
he's still a
stage?
teenager, 18, 19, I think. Then he starts teaching Sunday school, and he takes on sort of office-bearing roles. So it starts to give him some organisational skills. It's where he first speaks in public, giving an address to the Sunday school, for example. So a lot of the skills you need as a politician, he actually develops through that organisation.
Right. And so the Sunday school is under the auspices of this spiritualist group.
Yes.
Right.
When you look at a lot of organisations that are formed in the 19th century, they also see themselves as educating the children, so there was a Sunday school. And then in Melbourne at that period, on Sunday evenings, there's lectures that are given by different groups. There's charismatic preachers who you might go and hear give their Sunday night sermon.
And were there political messages in the spiritualist movement that would have influenced him, do you think,
Well,
Judy?
I think one of them is that women have a sort of equality in it. Women can be mediums too. It's a way that women can.
So it's quite socially liberal? Is that the impression?
Yes. I guess it's on the edge of respectability. No, I think it's relatively respectable, but women do have a role. It's probably seen as progressive. One of Deakin's things carries from this throughout his life is he's a bit anti-clerical, and he's very hostile to sectarianism, to the sort of dogmatic schisms that were amongst the various Christian churches. Like at that time, there's a big scandal around Charles Strong, who was this charismatic preacher at Scott's Church in Melbourne, who was seen as being heretical and was basically hounded out of his pulpit. So Deakin's very against dogma in Christianity. And so in that sense, it puts him against the sort of established, powerful churches.
I see. Which is also quite important for Australian liberalism too, that eschews an established church in Australia and those ideas.
Yes.
So he's following that tradition. He's employed as a journalist. How does that help him as well in his sort of, I guess, an eventual quest to become a politician? And he becomes a politician very young. I can't believe that he was quite so young.
He starts, because he wants to make some money and he wants to be a writer, he starts sending unsolicited articles in to The Age, which is at that point, it's edited by David Syme, who's an extremely powerful figure, a bit like the sort of Rupert Murdoch of his day in Melbourne. It sees itself as a progressive paper. And he sends a couple of things in, and he knew Syme vaguely through spiritualist circles. Syme's wife was quite involved. So, Melbourne's pretty small too at this stage. And he doesn't ever actually get employed by them. He's paid as a sort of jobbing journalist. He's paid per piece that he submits. But it means that he starts covering the parliamentary debates and writing reports on those. So that introduces him, gives him a rapid lesson in how politics works, how debates work, and what the issues of the day are.
How does he get into politics then? At the very young age of 22, I can see.
Well, there's, I think it's a by-election, and it's for a seat which is held by, we'll call them the Conservatives. The Liberals, who are really in a sense being run by David Syme pretty much, don't think they've got much of a chance. So nobody much is interested in standing. And so David Symes suggests to the committee who's got to find a candidate, well, young Deakin might do it. And young Deakin thinks, all right, I'll do it.
So he hadn't had a particular interest in running for Parliament before that. It was on the approach of David Symes and his committee, right?
Yeah. And then he says he was sort of whirled into politics, is the metaphor he uses. And, of course, it's very exciting. I mean, he's hardly left Melbourne. He finds himself in a coach having to go and talk to meetings of electors up at Romsey, just in the sort of hills north of Melbourne. He doesn't drink, so that's a bit of a handicap when most of the meetings are happening in pubs and people are having beers afterwards and things. And lo and behold, he wins the seat.
Yeah, amazing. Although he has to relinquish it, doesn't he?
Well, he decides to relinquish it.
Yeah.
Because there's a bit of a breakdown in some of the electoral organisation, and at one of the polling booths they run out of ballot papers. And so some people who turn up to vote, they were all men, some men, find they can't vote. And so in the paper then doubt is cast over his election. And he, being very moral and concerned and proud and not wanting to have any doubt cast on him, decides to resign.
But runs straight away again in the same seat.
Then he runs again.
So, I mean, this is the beginning of his political career at the ripe old age of 22.
23, yes.
It's amazing. And it's obviously in the colony of Victoria, in the Victorian Parliament. What's his political career like in the Victorian Parliament?
Well, it turns out when he starts campaigning in that first electoral campaign and then in the subsequent ones until he, finally nails a seat, that he's a great orator, that he's got the power to really hold an audience and move them. And at that time, Parliament was not organised in terms of the disciplined parties that we're used to from the 20th century. So parliamentary oratory was quite important because if you were presenting a bill, you had to actually persuade enough of the men in the House to vote for it. And campaigning obviously was face-to-face, so he had that capacity. And that was, in a sense, one of the really key political skills that somebody needed if they wanted to be a parliamentarian. They needed to be able to talk to mass meetings.
Was there a sense in the mid-late 19th century that in the Parliament the votes were much more up for grabs?
Yeah, that's right.
You could actually, through your oratory, convince people of your position.
And also the political leaders would organise a group around themselves. I think the other thing about Deakin in the early 1880s is that older men are charmed by him. Syme was charmed by him. That's why, in a way, Syme fosters his career. Graham Berry, who had been the Premier in the 70s, was charmed by him. Even though he's quite a private person, he's got the capacity to, when he's talking to somebody, and this comes through various memoirs and things, to make that person feel as if they're the only person in the room.
Yeah.
It's
charismatic. Then.
Yes, it's a charisma.
Even though he was obviously a bit odd in some respects.
Well, it didn't necessarily come through in that. And he'd listen to people, and he was a great talker and charmer.
Because you describe him as not being a sort of a mate. He didn't drink, he didn't play organised sport, he didn't swear. I mean, that's not such a bad thing, but he was courteous but perhaps considered a bit aloof and separate. So it's interesting, his ability to convince people, to be charismatic, to make them feel really special.
I think that sense of aloofness really increases in the 1890s. I think he's got more close male friends and things in the 80s. But it's clear that when he first gets into Parliament, he's, in a sense, sponsored. He gets a ministry very early. So great faith is placed in his capacities. And the Parliament is full of gold rush migrants who, came out as young men and who are now in middle age. And he's born here, so he's native born, which is really important, and he's young, he's very bright, and he's charming, and he can talk.
How much was his politics influenced by David Syme, do you think?
Look, I think it was quite influenced by David Syme. I mean, David Syme, the big conversion that he talks about is English liberals were all very committed to free trade, and it was like a core belief of English liberalism. David Syme becomes convinced that in the circumstances of a new colony, protection so that infant industries can be built is compatible with liberalism. And that's what he convinces Deakin of, that this way the colony can grow, it can develop its own manufacturing industry. And it met a real need because the population of Victoria had expanded very rapidly in the 1850s. The gold ran out, and what were these people going to do? Most of them didn't have enough money to go back home. So a manufacturing industry would provide employment. So
it was an uncompetitive one, or
well, they were basically wanting to protect themselves against Britain. So they didn't. So they weren't that worried about whether it was competitive. They saw it as a policy that would aid the development of the colony.
But without protection, they wouldn't have been able to build that industry because the British-made products would have undercut them. Was David Syme's view, though, of protectionism as a professed liberal, was it that eventually you would be able to eradicate protectionism in favour of free trade, but that infant industry
was an infant industries, and I don't think they thought that far ahead,
Okay.
I think they were focused on jobs for the people, because the other big liberal cause was to break up the big pastoral holdings of basically the men who got here first in the 1840s and squatted, was to break that up for family farm. There was a popular demand for land.
And, I mean, Alfred Deakin's in the Victorian Parliament for 20 years. There's obviously other issues apart from the fiscal issue, the free trade versus protectionism, and that, of course, on the liberal side of politics becomes the sort of key divide between the two major factions, if you like. But tell me, what about his other political positions on things like social welfare and industrial relations issues and even Indigenous rights?
Okay, so there's a lot there. I mean, the event that turns Deakin into a celebrity, because he is a celebrity in Victorian politics, is that he is included as part of the government's delegation to an imperial conference in London. Now, at the time, there was a crisis, what was going on in the near Pacific, in the New Hebrides. And the French had colonies there. The Germans were sniffing around. They had the top of New Guinea. And there was a big push for Britain to annex the New Hebrides. Now, Britain didn't want to do this. Britain thought it had enough colonies to manage. And so when Deakin goes to the imperial conference, along with the others who were all born in Britain and all had the sort of class deference built into them, Deakin basically argues with the British Prime Minister. And this is so shocking, really. And he doesn't really seem to have much awareness of how shocking it is, because he doesn't have that inbuilt understanding of class and class hierarchies.
And his place and where he should.
And he probably writes the account of it himself and sends it back home. And so he becomes seen as representing Australian interest.
How had he been selected to go to this imperial conference?
I can't remember. I think it's because he was at that stage the chief minister
of Victoria.
There's a premier, and the chief minister is like the person who deals with the internal matters,
Yeah. So he becomes a celebrity in Australia through this.
Particularly to the young native-born men. So he's seen there as thinking about in foreign policy terms, because this becomes an important theme even in his prime ministership, of where we're located on the globe and how our interests might be a little different from the British interests, even though he never questions our membership of the British Empire. But he does understand that there may be different perspectives and different interests. The other thing he does that is of lasting significance is he becomes very interested in irrigation. He's sent on an exploratory trip to California very early on to look at their irrigation system, and he comes back full of ideas, and he invites the Chaffee brothers to people involved with the irrigation colonies in California out to set up an irrigation colony on the Murray, and that becomes Mildura. So the irrigation along there and then Renmark, I mean, all along there is actually started by Deakin and his vision that you can make the deserts bloom. He's also very instrumental in pushing through the first Factory Acts. Factory Acts were acts to basically regulate the employment conditions of people, working hours, the age conditions that women should have, particular sanitation requirements. They were weaker than he'd wanted them to be, but that was also a progressive achievement. He supports trade unions being made legal. So in that sense, you know, they're all things that we associate with progressive politics. Now, you also asked me about Indigenous issues. This is quite complex. Early on in the first part of the 1880s, he's very sympathetic to individual Indigenous people and the interests of the people living on the reserve at Corranderk up in the Dandenongs. But in 1887, he sponsors a bill called, I can't remember now what it was called because it's colloquially now become known as the Half-Caste Act. And what it does is it says, because at that stage, Indigenous people are being supported by basically welfare payments, and the reserves have welfare payments. Now, the reserves are under the control of the Aboriginal Protection Board, and Deakin has more liberal views than they have about the freedoms that people have. But anyway, the key thing in this act is that it distinguishes between full-blood Aborigines and what were then called half-castes. And it says, well, okay, the state will continue to support full-blood Aborigines, but half-castes, once they're of working age, should leave the reserves and go and get a job and assimilate. So looking at it from today, what this did was it broke up families because it sent, you know, adult children who were of mixed descent off the reserves. It deprived those reserves which had been trying to become self-sufficient, grow their own vegetables and, you know, build their dwellings and things. It deprived them of adult labour, of the mixed descent people. So it didn't recognise Aboriginal kinship structures, and that from the perspective of the Aboriginal, probably mainly mothers, the fact that their child was of mixed descent didn't make any difference, was not meaningful to them.
Still your child.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't meaningful to them, and they were embedded in complex kinship structures, which were sort of invisible, really, to the sort of settler eye. It also was an assimilationist policy, even though they didn't use that word, but that was the idea. So the idea was that the full bloods would gradually die out and that their descendants, most of whom, you know, were of mixed race, would gradually blend in with the rest of the population.
Yeah.
And so
Aboriginal race, as they had found it, would no longer really exist. There'd be descendants, but they were so fully integrated
that
into
they would be,
society.
yes, that they would be, yes. There was no idea. So there was very little understanding of cultural difference or interest in cultural difference. Yes, so that they would just sort of blend in, and then Aboriginality or the Aboriginal society or belief system would just sort of fade away.
And this was quite a common view, this sort of idea that Aborigines would just die out naturally through disease and other factors, and that they'd become, you know, they wouldn't be a feature of sort of
and
future Australian
the thing is, there aren't really, like now in Victoria, there would be, I imagine, no full-blood Aborigines left. I mean, there are in the north. But so there's not much interest in their culture. The culture is not seen as valuable in itself or interesting in itself.
There's not a curiosity.
There's not a curiosity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the things, because Deakin is actually very interested in comparative religion. You know, he's interested in Islam, he's interested in Hinduism, he reads the Quran, but he's not at all interested in the spiritual lives of Aboriginal people. It's probably just too remote and inaccessible at that stage.
Deakin, of course, is one of the fathers of Federation, incredibly important figure, if not the most important figure. He's really driven to this by his association with this Australian Natives Association, which I don't think is very well known these days, but it's so important in the 19th century and beyond, actually, in the early 20th century. Can you explain who they were?
Okay, so the Australian Natives Association, it starts off as a friendly society. Friendly societies were like a sort of organisation you could join and pay a membership fee to, and they provided a degree of insurance for you in the case of illness or death. They would provide perhaps a bequest for your widow and children. They could provide funeral expenses. So they're like an insurance society. Now, they were
sort of a bit of superannuation, a bit of life insurance, a bit of a pension, a bit
and health benefits,
and a bit of Medicare. So precursor to the welfare state that we know today.
Yes, so they were common, through the 19th century, and particularly therefore for working people who have very little capital. Right, so they're essentially sort of a cooperative insurance organisation. Now, they were generally organised along ethnic grounds. So I think there was, the Hibernian Society for Irish people, and there was the Orange Lodge. And, so the native-born men decide they'll have one of their own, and that's why they call that the Australian Natives Association. Now, during the 1880s, when the annexation crisis is happening in Victoria, the ANA becomes more political, and it sees itself not just as a friendly society providing insurance benefits, but as able to be the political voice of the men who were born here and whose fate is here. And so when Deakin, who's a member of the ANA, stands up in England and argues for Australian interests, that's when he becomes their hero.
And out of this comes this push towards federation.
When they also then become very keen on federation, because it's seen that if the Australian colonies could speak with one voice, they'd have much more chance of making their case to the British government rather than bickering and having different views.
What was Deakin's role in the lead up to federation and federation itself? Okay,
so Deakin resigns from the Victorian government in the early 1890s. What's gone on, like the 1880s is a boom, particularly in Victoria. It's the era of marvellous Melbourne. Everything is going gangbusters. The government is spending money hand over fist. And in the early 90s, basically the economy crashes and there's a depression, and it comes out that there's been a land boom, and some of the parliamentarians have actually been, pretty corrupt in that. And Deakin is shocked and disgusted and depressed. I think what happens is that, and federation is sort of stirring, is that he, in a way, he doesn't resign from Parliament. I mean, he could resign from Parliament and go to the bar. He'd never actually had much success as a lawyer, but by then, and he does actually, because you can be a parliamentarian and have another job in those days.
Yeah, it's quite common.
Yeah. So he is doing some work at the bar, but he stays in Parliament, and then as the federal cause picks up momentum, he takes that up as a cause. Now, Deakin is a Hegelian. That is, he thinks that the higher unity is always better. So if the colonies could come together, they could form a nation. And in the 19th century, the idea of a nation, it's seen as an ideal. I mean, there's Europe is, Bismarck is trying to join the Germans into a nation. There's national movements starting in the Habsburg Empire. The idea of the nation carries a lot of progressive idealism.
Yeah.
And so I think Deakin shifts his progressive idealism, if you like, onto the cause of federation.
Yeah. Do you think he was as instrumental as he writes in his memoirs and other writings that he was pretty instrumental? Do you think he was?
I think he was instrumental in Victoria because David Syme, who's still very powerful, is not convinced about federation. The reason he's not convinced is because of the undemocratic Senate. They're Democrats. They think the fact that, the Tasmanians are going to have the same number of senators as people in New South Wales is completely, and they're not going to back the Constitution while that's in. However, if it's not in, you're not going to get the smaller states in. No. You're not going to get the agreement in. So Deakin is quite persuasive in Victoria in shifting Syme. And when Syme shifts, the political elite shifts. But John Hurst always said to me that he thinks that George Reid's role is also very underplayed by Deakin. Deakin couldn't stand George Reid. George Reid is the premier and a leading conservative figure in New South Wales. He gets described as conservative by Victorians, but he's only conservative because he supports free trade. He sees himself as a liberal, and
And probably a true liberal in the English tradition.
In the English sense, that's right.
Yeah, not the David Syme reinterpreted tradition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because, he's similarly supports Factory Acts and is a Democrat. But New South Wales is very wary of federation because of the trade issue. It knows that Victoria is for protection. There was division in New South Wales over it, but there's a strong belief in free trade. They've got a different sort of economy. They've got a stronger pastoral economy. They're starting to have a bit of mining. So they're more export oriented and hence they have more economic reasons for being supportive of free trade. So Reid, in the end, is able to bring New South Wales to the table. And once you've got, so in a way they're sort of like equally important, I guess.
Yes.
Once you've got those two major, where the bulk of the population is.
Yeah. Federation occurs. It's great. And, of course, 1901, we have our new parliament and Deakin becomes Attorney General initially, yes. Edmund Barton becoming our first Prime Minister. He does become Prime Minister subsequently and then is Prime Minister 2 times after that. His politics and policies have been called latterly the Australian settlement. I know you've used the term Deakinite settlement. These were sort of the policies that kind of shaped that early years of Australia and were the sort of accepted policies that really all sides of politics kind of thought, well, this is how our nation's going to operate under these broad policies. Can you describe them?
Okay. So I think the key thing, the big surprise of the first decade is the rapid electoral rise of the Labor Party. And so when Deakin does become Prime Minister, he's Prime Minister with a minority government. And
what do they call it? The 3/11ths?
Yeah, so basically a third of the parliament is Deakinite protectionists, a third is George Reid style free trade. And Reid has also become more conservative at this point, and a third of it is Labor. And Deakin basically governs with the support of the Labor Party. I mean, they don't sign agreements, but they support much of the legislation. And so that's why you get protection being embedded. There's still some Labor people who are not so keen on it, but Labor parliamentarians have to all vote together.
Yes.
So in a way they provide a block, whereas the others all don't have to vote together. So I think that's important. I mean, the White Australia policy, the restricted immigration policy, that is supported by everybody.
Yeah.
So that's
sort of uncontroversial.
Yeah, that's sort of uncontroversial.
Yeah.
And
the first act of federation.
Yes. And again, I think that when we look at it now, we don't see it. I think we need to see it in terms of 19th century nationalism, because 19th century, the idea of a nation, a self-governing nation, was of a group of if you like, ethnically, racially, religiously united people being self-governing. And it wasn't just sort of Anglo-Saxon, There was a lot of Europeans in Australia after the gold rushes and a lot of Germans, for example, and a lot of Italians. But there was this notion that for a self-governing polity to work, it needed to be reasonably culturally homogeneous.
Yeah. I mean, it obviously ages very badly and now we look at it with a sort of degree of shame, but of course.
Well, I mean, I think it's silly to look at it with a degree of shame.
Yeah.
I just think it's sort of historically myopic in a way, but it's also like morally preening for the contemporary period, as if we'd been back there, we would have done anything different.
Which we wouldn't have.
Because it was widely popular.
There weren't voices
and it was also
calling for a different approach.
No, and I think one of the reasons it was passed so quickly was because it was one of the things that everybody in the parliament would agree on. So it would help provide a degree of political unity and workability to the parliament.
It's quite extraordinary when you think about the world in 1901 to realise how progressive Australia's democracy and the nation was. You know, we had the secret ballot, we had universal adult suffrage. I mean, amazing. An advanced system of social welfare, compulsory arbitration and white Australia. But we were brand new in a time when there weren't that many democracies and there were lots of different ways of creating a nation. We did something quite remarkable that a lot of this has endured to this day.
Yeah, and I think part of it, like the Labor Party gets government here earlier. I mean, it's stronger here
First
than anywhere.
ever National Labor Party, isn't it?
Yeah, 1904.
Yeah.
And then it gets the first majority government. And one of the things that first I was really interested in with Deakin when I did the book on Australian Liberals and the moral middle class is, we're jumping ahead a bit, is, you know, because Deakin is actually very sympathetic to much of what Labor wants. When I was talking about the difference between Deakin and George Reid, I should add it wasn't just about trade. It was also about what role should the state play. And Deakin and other of the Victorian Liberals like Charles Pearson and Henry Bourne Higgins, they believed that the state could be active, for example, in passing education acts, that laissez-faire liberalism where the state's role was simply to support law and order and contracts and let the market do what it wanted. They were what we would now call social liberals. They believed that the state could intervene in the market in order to make more equal opportunity for everybody so that everybody had the chance to develop their God-given potential. You know, there is a sort of a Christian underpinning to a lot of this social liberalism. George Reid was not quite as convinced. He felt that the Deakinite Liberals' view of the state was too big, that state enterprises were, you know, some of that should be better left to the private sector. You know, so there is also a difference there about the role of the state. I mean, in many ways, Deakin was more like a social democrat.
Deakin's protectionists and Reid's free traders, they merge as a fused party.
Yes.
Do you think that the legacy of that is that, I mean, the Deakinites won? The free trade, you know, the smaller government, the obviously free trade, the perspective of the New South Wales tradition was demoted in favour of the sort of David Syme, Alfred Deakin interpretation of liberalism.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. And I think one of the reasons they won was that the first parliament sat in Melbourne. And I think part of the significance Deakin has in that first decade and that people like Higgins have is because the Commonwealth Parliament is sitting here. It's sitting in the Victorian legislative, you know, the Victorian chambers.
They're reading Victorian newspapers, The Age.
That's right. They're reading The Age
Sun's.
and they can go home at the end of the day. Yeah. George Reid is absent a lot of the time during that first decade because he's back in Sydney making money, because actually the parliamentarians were not paid a huge amount. And so he's having to support his family back in Sydney. He's having to live in lodgings here. He's missing a bit of the time. So as a leader of the opposition, he's in a weakened position. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that this sort of Victorian Deakinite liberalism gets the power it has. And if you look, until John Howard, the really significant prime ministers are all from Melbourne, Liberal prime ministers. There's Deakin, there's Stanley Melbourne Bruce, there's Menzies, there's Fraser.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. Why did Deakin fuse the two parties?
Look, he really didn't have much choice. The Deakinite Liberals were losing their inner city seats. I mean, to the Labor Party.
I see. And it was a first past the post system.
It was a first past the post system. Yeah. Deakin argued for preferential voting, you know, early on because it would have saved his party. But they'd always seen themselves as friends of the workers, but they were essentially a middle class party, whereas Labor was putting working men into politics. And Deakin wanted to do an agreement with the Labor Party that they would not stand candidates against the Liberals. against his Liberals, but the Labor Party wouldn't agree. So he was seeing his parliamentarians basically picked off.
Yeah. But even though he was in a weakened position, his party's policies and positions ended up having preeminence over the party he merged with.
Yes, well, partly because they were supported by the Labor Party.
Yeah.
And Labor becomes the majority government in 1910.
So it sort of shifts the Overton window a bit in Australia, if you like, where the possible policies that are imagined are,
yes, I mean, because one of the
ones
things
that Labor champions.
Deakin says is that his policies, he doesn't put it quite this way, but how I would put it is because he had to get support from across the parliament, that means that they actually represent organic Australian policy because there's been input into them not just from one interest group or two, but from a range of interest groups. So I think that, and on foreign policy, like he starts the moves towards Australia establishing an independent navy. Well, Andrew Fisher agrees with that. A lot Labor in that first 3-year majority government continues with a lot of those policies.
Yeah. It's a podcast for another day, I think, the legacy of Deakin, particularly how it impacts on Robert Menzies, who I think does as a young boy, doesn't he? He sees Alfred Deakin speak. So their lives cross over a bit, but not really Menzies in adulthood. But, I mean, that's a profound influence, of course. But do you think that is the enduring legacy of Deakin, is the legacy on Robert Menzies and the development of liberalism in Australia?
Well, I think, Menzies was always sort of civil and well-mannered. Deakin was a very civil man. And so I think Menzies was also against sectarianism, which I think is another legacy. I think Deakin was a man of great integrity too. There was never a whiff of corruption or hanky-panky around Menzies. So I think Menzies' idea of politics as a noble pursuit, that Deakin embodied that for him, I think, because, one can disagree with various positions he took, but he was not a self-serving, self-seeking man, and he tried to cooperate. So I think that's a legacy, and I think there's a legacy too in Labor, in the way in which Labor has probably been more critical of Australia's position in the empire and, where it looked to America and began the American alliance, because Deakin in 1908, when there's arguments about the Navy, he invites the American Great White Fleet out, and that's off his own bat as the Prime Minister, which really annoys the powers that be in Britain. So I think that, there's legacies in a way on both sides.
Yeah. Well, fascinating discussion, Judy, about an incredibly important Australian, a nationalist in the positive sense of the word, a great nation builder and someone we all owe a huge debt to. So really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.